separations through an understanding of the silence on race discursively and how it's played out institutionally and manifest materially. And I'm conscious here to integrate post-colonialism and development and to reveal then some of those tenacious strands of racialized forms of knowing, racialized forms of representing in development discourse and practice, and address some of those material, institutional and discursive elements of race and racism within international development. Right? How can we explain those silences, those erasures, those omissions about race in development? Well, the first thing I suppose to note is that development studies didn't just sort of emerge at a particular moment in time as a discipline, but it has its historical roots in Britain in what was called colonial studies. And Killingree, writing about colonial studies, says that race wasn't always so silent in development. Essentially he writes, colonial studies, was concerned with the policy and practice of ruling subject peoples who were mainly of a darker colour and mostly lived in the tropics. So when you ask, well, who are your students or who is your research for or about, then you could say, well, it's people over there who are of a darker colour and basically live in the tropics. So it's about sort of biological, immutable, fixed notion of identity and a bounded geographical space, the tropics out there. And I think that that history clearly has implications for development studies today. So international development then, this massive machine or industry, as Jonathan Crush calls it, is global in its reach. It encapsulates ideologies, right, preeminently modernization and neoliberalism, which have remained dominant over the course of its development. It also encapsulates institutions and agencies, so the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, but also international NGOs, Oxfam, Save the Children Fund, bilaterals, Canadian CEDA, Swedish CEDA, the UK Department for International Development. And within those and outside of those, a whole collection of individuals, researchers, academics, consultants, so-called development experts, policymakers, and of course, recipients of development aid, the so-called beneficiaries of development. And all those come together, those ideologies, those institutions, and the individuals, they all come together to address and to meet certain goals and targets. Now, we might not agree that actually they are meeting them. We might not even agree that they think that they're trying to meet them. But this is what's on the table when people talk about development aid. So it's about participation, about empowerment, poverty alleviation, natural resource management, environmental sustainability, etc. So development studies then is multidisciplinary. It is a discipline, it draws from different disciplines. And when I joined the Institute for Development Policy and Management, they were mainly geographers, and I'm a social geographer myself. But it doesn't mean that it's interdisciplinary. So within development studies, there's these competing threads, these competitions all the time, particularly between those on the social side of the social sciences and those on the economic side. And there's an ongoing tension within development studies. And I think that gets played out in all kinds of ways when we start thinking about race. So as a shorthand then, I would say that development is primarily about, in terms of its mainstream orthodox way of being represented, is mainly about OECD donors providing development assistance in the form of overseas aid, and they've all signed up to what are known as the Millennium Development Goals, which are the goals of halving absolute poverty by the year 2015, etc. And there's a whole range of targets and goals. Now, whatever our perspective, whatever the perspective of the individuals, whether it's somebody from the World Bank or from a community-based organization, whatever the perspective, development is based on the recognition and the acknowledgement of global differences. And some of us might even go further, which doesn't sound very far to some of us, but might even go further and say, well, it's not just about global difference, it's about global inequities and global unevenness. It has to be because it's called development, and there are some people who are providing aid in order for some kind of transformation amongst other groups of people. So it's framed then by a distinct relationship between aid donors and recipients, mapped onto a first world, third world divide, or a developed and an underdeveloped or developing divide. Now that embeds a series of dichotomies dualisms and binaries, and we're very familiar with them: the West and the rest, the first and third, developed and developing, global north, global south, donor and beneficiary. And all of those binaries, those dichotomies, come to represent or symbolize other kinds of differences. Right? So mapped onto those binaries are other, sometimes symbolic, representational differences or divisions, where the former, the first, the developed, etc., put simply, are thought to be modern, civilized, and democratic, for example, and the latter, traditional, even barbaric, and very often corrupt. So we map onto that kind of geographical difference all kinds of representational dualisms. And what I would argue is that racialized forms of power and inequality are built upon that foundational difference. So talking about first and third isn't just about the ways in which people come together socially, economically, and politically. They're also about people's identities and subjectivities and about global inequalities. So development then is largely related to a geopolitics of race, where developed countries take an interest in and consider the needs of poor countries in ways that often issue directly from their own preoccupations and strategic political, cultural, and economic objectives and perspectives. So it's not, as we know, all about the Millennium Development Goals. And this geopolitics of race focuses on how racialized discourses underpin Western ideologies and therefore influence the understandings and representations of the so-called third world. And what it then draws our attention to, if we try and interrogate this kind of geopolitics, it draws attention to the various unspoken assumptions about race that are embedded in development thought and practice. Right? Because racial classifications continue to categorize different groups of people. So what I'm arguing is that those kinds of dichotomies, and this isn't new for most of you, but these kinds of dichotomies that we use almost unproblematically between developed and developing, or donor and beneficiary, actually articulate racialized formations, racialized projects, and racialized classifications. And there are many ways in which discourses of development do that, that discourses of race and racism are concealed and disguised and obviated in development. There's many ways in which those silences take place, and many spaces within which that silence is almost deafening. And I focus on two interrelated ways. And one is the way in which development studies obscures a colonial genealogy. It writes out a particular part of its history. And the second is a sanitization of discourses, the kinds of terminology that's used in development that I would argue shifts our gaze away from thinking about race to thinking about more acceptable forms of difference, but are actually underpinned by race. So obscuring a colonial genealogy emerges from a project that I was working on for a number of years, which was to collect the life histories of former colonial administrators who were young enough at the time when Rhodesia, Tanganyika, gained independence. Right? When those colonies gained independence, they were young enough to still demand a career in the UK. Right? So they were too young to retire. And a disproportionate number of former colonial officers set up development studies institutes. And they used to be called, like mine used to be called, the Institute of Administrative Services. And it was basically to educate civil servants from sub-Saharan Africa, primarily, in order to run their own countries. Right? So my institute was the Institute of Administrative Studies, and it was a big battle in the 80s to change its title. So when I joined the institute in 1990, 5 of my colleagues were former colonial administrators. And very interestingly, and it's subject of a whole series of other papers, but you should have been at some of our institute board meetings, because they, of course, those kinds of representations don't stop at the time of independence, but they were transferred through, and that's partly what I want to talk about. So 2 forms then of the ways in which race is silenced in the discourse: the colonial genealogy and the sanitizing of discourses. So just before I start talking about those, just to say that in a way, when people say, well, you know, how does development